Hello and welcome to this special roundtable conversation, one of a series of reflective and explorative articles and discussions that taken together represent the People's Lockdown Inquiry. I'm Alastair Donald. I'm Associate Director at the Academy of Ideas, the organisation which has curated the People's Lockdown Inquiry on behalf of the Reclaim Party, which has commissioned it, an association with colleagues at University of Buckingham who've helped out with some of the material. Today, we're going to look at the impact on sport that has resulted from the past year of the COVID pandemic and from the government response to it. We'll explore the impact at professional and grassroots levels and consider what it means for participants, spectators, institutions, and businesses. To kick off, I'm going to ask each of our panel to introduce themselves, just a few words so we know who they are, which sports particularly interest them, and who they follow, etc., etc. So, Donald, do you want to introduce yourself first, please?
Sure thing. Yeah. So my name's Donald Clark. You can tell I'm from Scotland, but I'm actually sitting in Brighton, where I've been for 36 years now. And I'm a Brighton and Hove Albion supporter, which surprises the people when I go to the stadium with this accent, and have been for all those years. But when I was in Scotland, I was a football fanatic as a kid. The Glasgow Rangers was the team I saw as a boy, home and away. And sport has touched my life in all sorts of ways. The main one is my son is in the England team for Taekwondo. And of course, the COVID hit him hard in terms of his competing. We were just about to go to the European Championships when it was cancelled. In other ways, my wife, funnily enough, she has lots of professional sports people in her family in swimming, golf, and so on. And then on top of that, you know, I've been involved in sponsoring football. I'm a business guy, entrepreneur by background, floating companies and so on. So I've always, I really think that football has an amazing role at grassroots level, and have sponsored football teams in working class Scotland and the places I've come from. I think it has a huge role there, and I'm now sponsoring a Taekwondo initiative here in Brighton for homeless people and disadvantaged kids and so on.
Okay, thanks, Donald. I'm sure it's great to have a happy Glasgow Rangers fan here celebrating a first championship in a decade. So welcome to you. Rob, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Rob. I'm a Science and Technology Director at the Academy of Ideas. I'm also a journalist and I'm a columnist for Spiked, and I write elsewhere as well. My interest in sport, well, I'm from Birmingham, but I'm a Liverpool fan and have been since I was 6 years old. So I'm not just a latecomer to it. My other interests are mainly cricket and boxing and the UFC, I guess, as well, although I wouldn't say that I'm a hardcore follower of any of these things. And I used to play for a couple of seasons. I played club cricket in Birmingham for the Bourneville Factory second 11, leg break and googly, and not very good at keeping score when I was asked to keep score. So that's my sort of trajectory on this.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Welcome to you. Christine, shall I come to you next?
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much. I'm joining you from Woking in Surrey, and I don't claim any particular qualification or right to comment on this, other than sport and outdoor activities have been part of my life for as long as I can remember. I spent my formative years in the sports mad world of Southern Africa, being involved in school and club swimming, hockey and tennis teams. And obviously being there at the time that Mandela was released from prison. So got very much caught up in the excitement of South Africa's re-entry into global sport after that. So I think I'd say the South African Rugby World Cup win in 1995 definitely sticks out as one of the most memorable sporting memories in my life. Currently, I belong to a golf club. I play a lot of golf, and I've been a member for sort of 20 years of the David Lloyd leisure centres, where I play tennis and use the gym. So I think I would probably say, like millions of people worldwide, I'm an avid fan of big sporting events, you know, particularly tennis, golf, rugby and cricket, which I follow all the time. And I suppose I would describe myself as a bit of a weekend warrior, someone who loves the sociability and competition of sport, And just personally, I'm very interested in the mental side of sport, and particularly what makes elite athletes perform. So to many people, sport matters. So I don't think it's a frivolous discussion. I think it's very, very relevant actually to what's gone on over the past year.
Okay, thanks, Christine. We'll return to that question, I think, of why sport matters in this context in a minute. But Declan, do you want to just introduce yourself, say a few words?
Cool. Thanks, Alastair. I'm Declan. I'm 21 and I'm from North London, and I'm a massive football fan. But through lockdown, I've got into new sports like tennis and basketball and UFC as well. So I support Tottenham and Celtic. So obviously not happy about the Rangers title, but we move. And yeah.
Okay, and we can come to that later.
Yeah.
Geoff, finally, you please.
Yeah, I'm Geoff Kidder. I'm Membership and Events Director at the Academy of Ideas. And for many years, I've organised the debates on sport, on drugs in sport, all kinds of issues around footballers as role models at the Battle of Ideas Festival, which has been held in London every year until last year. So that's really what I do. I'm a lifelong Bristol City fan, so the pain of lockdown has only been exacerbated by the poor state of our team and the management of our club over the past year or so. And I just hope for some better news from Somerset cricket during this summer. If they win one county championship while I'm still on this earth, my life will be complete.
Okay, thanks, Geoff. So to kick us off, let's just return to the thing that Christine was starting to pick up on a minute ago about, given the pandemic situation has created all sorts of havoc, from overrun hospitals to economies in meltdown to civil liberties under attack, then why is it important to discuss sport just now? I mean, some people might say, well, that's something that really is just not so important in this period. So why is sport important in terms of thinking about the response to the pandemic? Any thoughts?
I think sport is clearly a deep cultural phenomenon. And during the pandemic, you got lots of reflection in the commentariat around the arts and the impact on the arts, for example, but hardly anything on sport. And yet, especially for working people, it's been, it's a solace, but it's far more than that. We are the playful species. It's a universal, global, intensely personal phenomenon, sport. I was the chair of a big arts organization for over 10 years. And it was really tangible, the almost hatred they had for sport. It was quite the very opposite of, it was sort of tolerated as a working class thing in many ways. I always found that amazingly, disrespectful and odd. But I think its depth as a cultural phenomenon is obvious. That our arts organisations spent unbelievable sums of money on outreach programmes in all the council estates around about Brighton, where I live, but never thought about sport, which is actually what many of those people were fundamentally interested in, rather than some of the really sort of crazy schemes that were foisted upon them. So I think sport is as important as the arts, and therefore should be reflected upon.
From my perspective, I think one of the themes of lockdown has really been around isolation and mental health, and what sort of, in a way, unquantifiable toll the lockdown itself has taken on people in different ways. And I think it's so clear that sport and exercise are fundamental to so many people, to your well-being, to how you wake up every day and feel, if you've undertaken some exercise, if you're planning to participate in competition and so on, and go to the gym. But it's a unifying and sociable experience, and people make friends through sport, people meet friends through sport, you have purpose through sport. And I think this has been a very big theme of lockdown, is that a lot of our purpose has been taken away from us. A lot of our personal responsibility, our own accountability for things, the closing of gyms and so on, has meant that people have had to take personal responsibility for their own exercise, perhaps in ways that they hadn't before. And I feel like, speaking to people in my circle and reading what's in the papers, watching big sporting events, people long for sport to get something sociable, to get back together with friends, to have a drink with them, to bet on the Grand National for so on, as an example. And it's just part of the fabric of any nation. I mean, whether it's Britain, whether it's New Zealand with the All Blacks, you know, sport is just part of daily life. And to have it taken away, I think has been devastating for many people in different ways.
I understand what you mean. I attended the Liverpool Atletico Madrid European Cup match a year ago, which for many people was the start of this whole thing. Last night, I spent my time going halfway around London trying to find a pub to watch the match in, without success, it has to be said. So it is really deeply frustrating, some of these things. But Rob, you've got a thought?
Yeah, well, absence makes the heart grow fonder, and I think the lockdowns have really emphasised just how important sport is, both in its own right of the big events, because you know they are theatre and they're unwritten scripts, as it were, that you know you don't know how they're going to play out, and very often you have skin in the game because you very much support one of the participants or one of the teams involved. So they're hugely exciting things and hugely frustrating, and the whole gamut of emotions can be expressed through them. But also at the you know, just in terms of participating in sport as well, it's a great way of bringing people together. I mean, I remember more than 20 years ago being the best man at a wedding here in Scotland and trying to work out how do you get 12 blokes who've never really met each other before to sort of start socializing, and the ideal answer was a game of 6-a-side, which you know which meant we were interacting and having banter before we even had a drop to drink, and also gave us a great opportunity to steal the groom's clothes and replace them with women's underwear, so they had to spend the rest of the evening dressed like that, which was, you know, so it was a winner all round. And I'm sure there's lots of situations where sport provides that kind of coming together of people in a completely different way from, you know, work or from just going for a drink with friends or whatever. All those things apply as well, but there's something different about having a mass kickabout on the meadows in Edinburgh or whatever it is. That means that you start to get to know people in a way that avoids the problem of the initial small talk and all that sort of stuff. You know, you can get together and just enjoy a common experience together, and it's been much missed.
How would you summarize the overall effect of the pandemic and the government responses to it on sport over the past year then?
It's been quite a negative response overall. I think just the lack of fluidity and the lack of us knowing when the lack of transparency with the fans, whether it comes from playing grassroots football or watching it, we don't really know when we can play and when we can't play. And yeah, so I think it's quite negative overall. And just as a fan, you know, watching sport without the fans, it's just not the same.
We should also remember that sport has some responsibility here. You know, it's hanging around and waiting on the government to tell us type attitude. I mean, they had to react to a dynamic situation, a sort of dialectic between the science as it emerged, so it was tricky for them. But I don't think we should forget that in 2020, the Cheltenham Festival had 150,000 people for 4 days that led to definite deaths. We had the Liverpool tie with Atletico Madrid, we got beat 3-2, but that led to about 2 to 3 deaths per day in local hospitals. We had the Manchester Derby. So sports commercialism, you know, there's an inertia behind that drove it forward in a way that quite literally killed people. So there was a downside. But I think there was we've got 3 UFC fans here, I believe, myself included. They took a different view. You know, Dana White, who runs it, actually set up a thing called Fight Island in Abu Dhabi, took the whole thing seriously and sailed through this because they realized that, you know, you should not put spectators at risk. That would kill people. It's clearly going to be a super spreader situation. So I think that was one example where UFC has continued unabated because the organization took it on an island and took COVID seriously. I think football, you know, locally, we had season ticket holders, people who didn't have much money, being asked to pay more money to look at pay-per-view when they had already bought a season ticket. So I think the inertia behind the greed in sport took it into some rather unpalatable places?
I think there was a lot of inconsistency and mixed messaging around what was safe and what wasn't, and the idea of saying people you need to exercise, but then closing gyms and closing outdoor sports venues where people were quite clearly not going to bring a risk to themselves or to anyone else. And I think one of the ironies that I sort of observed during the first lockdown, and it was reinforced in the November and then again in the third lockdown, was a lot of the local golf courses around here in Surrey were closed. And as part of their kind of community commitment, they opened the courses to allow people to walk on them. And I've never seen so many people on the golf course in my life, whereas under normal circumstances, if people had just been playing golf, there would have been a tenth of the people that there were in that area. So I think that was a very contradictory approach. I think bodies like the English Golf Union and other bodies representing different sports, did a lot of lobbying to the government and went to extraordinary lengths to demonstrate the safety procedures in place and so on. And it feels like those were ignored for very irrational reasons. And there was never any kind of sense that a balance was taken into account. And I think, the fact that Scotland continued to play golf, for example, during the third lockdown and England couldn't, there was no consistency in that message. And I think a lot of that could have been handled far more rationally, and I think the government's lost a lot of credibility and trust as a result of that mixed messaging.
Yeah, I can remember actually having a conversation down here in England with someone who was complaining about not being able to get on the golf course at the same time as getting messages on my phone from someone in Scotland who was out playing golf. So there's a kind of that contradiction. It was quite stark at times. But Rob, yes.
I just think that one of the things that was showing up, especially early on, was that government doesn't quite understand sport or sports fans. So, for example, we had Jenny Harris standing up saying, "Oh, why are we not cancelling football matches?" "Oh, well, because people will just go watch them in the pub." Well, there's a very limited number of games that are on live anyway. I mean, that might apply, for example, to Six Nations, but because there's one game on at a time, and people tend to go to the pub and watch them. But if you're a Bristol City fan, for example, and they're playing Birmingham City, it's not going to be live on in the pub, and most Premier League games are not on, live in the pub. So as Christine said, this idea you can go for a walk, but you can't go for a walk if you're going to hit a little ball, just seems to be again just a real disconnect about these things. And I think that really shows in relation to ventilation that the government flipped from anything outside is fine to suddenly de-emphasizing what goes on outside, whereas in fact we could have been much more open and free in relation to outdoor activities, because ventilation has such a powerful effect on reducing the risk of transmission of this virus.
Some politicians, Rob, who were acutely aware of it, Matt Hancock, for example, who received £350,000 personally from the racing fraternity, green-lighted the Cheltenham Festival. They knew exactly what they were doing in green lighting that one. And then we have an issue that's arisen right now, which is the Olympics. The Japanese government are pushing ahead with the Olympics when 70% of the population have said in a recent poll that they didn't want it because Japanese has an aging population and is going through a terrible surge. So sometimes, the politicization of sport has driven it into some of these unpalatable areas as well. There would be no problem in delaying the Olympics until, we're right in this Goldilocks zone when the vaccines are being rolled out in most countries in the world, and the idiocy of the Olympics Committee and the Japanese government in politicizing the Olympics. It always has been, of course, Russia with doping and so on. That's the other side of this coin.
One of the things that really struck me about something like, for example, the tennis Open in Australia was that attempt to push on and to actually host these events, which in one way you can, I think, see as an admirable attempt to keep going. But on another level, resulted in a fairly farcical competition, not only devoid of fans and in the stadium and sort of lacking in atmosphere, but just organizationally chaotic. So where do you stand on all of this?
I don't know. I mean, Donald, I'm not sure. I don't know. The Cheltenham Festival last year, it's become an iconic event that was a super spreader event or then led to these things, which, I mean, you make the financial points, but obviously within society, you know, COVID was new, people weren't sure of the situation. And whatever the truth, it's largely anecdotal because there wasn't so much testing at the time. But obviously the thing went ahead and all these people mixed, and it was seen by many people as just about okay at the time. And that was a snapshot then. And the snapshot now is that obviously Cheltenham happened this year, but with no fans. And that was widely seen as being right. And even in football events like the Carabao Cup final, which is going to have 8,000 out of the possible 100,000, it's become now totally accepted that you have with quite strict measures, you have a very small or relatively small audience to watch it who take very strong precautions. So the society has gone from what you might say as being a cavalier approach a year ago, or was looking back is seen in that way, to a very, very cautious approach. I think my view would be that once a country is vaccinated, as the UK is getting there, then ideally you would get back to the previous situation you had before as quickly as is practicable. And maybe things are a bit, you know, rules coming in now, oh, no under 18s can go to some football matches or whatever. It's just kind of arbitrary regulations being brought in. Whereas you'd much rather people were, you know, pushing back against that a bit. And I think the Australian Open tennis, even though they had all kinds of problems in terms of the quarantining beforehand, the actual event, with some exceptions, worked reasonably well and showed what could be done. And I've certainly got no objections. Looking at Japan and the Olympics, I'd like it to go ahead. When I see that Japan's only vaccinated 1% of its population, you can see there are issues there. And you think, well, a country like Japan, maybe they should have vaccinated a lot more of their population, and you know, the event could go ahead in a less controversial fashion. I'm not sure. I'd like it to go ahead if it could. Ideally, you'd like normal life to continue, except where it can't. That's my general approach. Although there are real issues, obviously, with international travel, with fans not being able to go there, and on people, particularly the athletes, not having practice. So there are real challenges there.
I'm going to bring you back in to comment on that in a minute, but I want to come to Declan first, Declan, because I noticed that you've been tweeting a lot recently about tennis.
Yeah.
I wondered what your thoughts were on this. And I know you expressed your disappointment earlier at the football, but is it kind of as someone that's young and presumably wants to get out to these tournaments and go to matches?
Well, I think I agree with Geoff. I think the Australian Open, as much as it had its problems, I think it was one of the most successful events I've seen happen throughout lockdown. If you'd maybe forget about UFC, and probably the most fun I've enjoyed watching a tournament was the Australian Open. But I think in terms of like getting into a sport, and obviously Wimbledon was cancelled, and like it does have quite a big strain. You get into a new sport and you're not able to go to Wimbledon and watch, and it can stop maybe people getting into the sport. So I agree, if it's possible to make it happen, then push through and make it happen.
So Donald, I think that the thing that Geoff said about the restrictions that are coming in just now on a lot of the matches, for example, that are being used as part of this social distancing review, the League Cup final coming up and the FA Cup semi-finals and finals are going to be quite restrictive in terms of the people that can attend, not just solely on the numbers, but on the type of people that can go. So, for example, under 18s will not be allowed to attend these matches, or people who are judged in someone's eyes, not necessarily the person going's eyes, to be vulnerable, won't be allowed to be admitted to these matches. So is there a danger that we're putting in place a series of restrictions and discriminations, in fact, that are actually going to be kind of more problematic in the long term?
Not really. I mean, I think I sort of agree with Geoff's point there, really. But, you know, going back to the Cheltenham thing, that it wasn't anecdotal. You know, there was serious level scientific advice about stopping the Cheltenham Festival, and lobbying occurred, and it went ahead and people died. I think that's morally bankrupt. You know, it was a terrible event to have happened. We have a different view now. The scientific advice is being taken seriously. And I'm not convinced by this argument that it's a bit ad hoc and all over the place. I think these things, you know, having been involved with my son, who is at an international level in sport, and I mean, he's been keenly aware, and that's in Taekwondo, and he knows lots of people in UFC and mixed martial arts. They take it seriously because it's a contact sport. But it's not just, of course, there's the spectacle and the spectators. This is largely about the spectators issue. And of course, there, it's all about infection. And I think it's tragic that people, you know, of Declan's age can't go see these things, but it is for the benefit of the greater good. It's a utilitarian principle, as it were, you know, that we have these restrictions because most of the young people will not have been vaccinated. And therefore, if you have mixed ages at these sports events, there is a danger of infection. So I think the scientific advice is sensible. I think the decisions that are being made seem to be rational to me, but I think we have general agreement that the quicker we get back under safe conditions, the better. But I don't think that's true of the Olympics. I think it's rushing back in July. Geoff rightly said 1% vaccinations in a country that's got a very elderly skew in its population. The population themselves don't want it, and yet the Olympic Committee and the politicians are pushing ahead. The danger is that we rush too early into some of these events. I think, you know, we're on this final lap, the final lap in vaccinations. Why take the risks now? You know, this will all bounce back. Let it happen in its own good time without pushing it.
Quite a lot of things just now seem to be happening on the basis of people's safety consciousness and nervousness and understandable anxieties about coming back out into society seem to be used as the means to keep things closed down, to delay opening up. I mean, I very much get the sense just now that the government is very, very nervous about opening things up, despite some of the advice, you know, even where the scientists have given advice that we're, you know, pushing into a situation where things are pretty safe to open. There still seems to be a distinct nervousness. So this idea that the host, like Donald said, the host population of Japan don't particularly want the Olympics. I mean, what's the balance between authorities pushing ahead to open up things and a nervous population who perhaps don't want things opened up, determining that they stay closed?
If I thought in 12 months' time you could have the Olympics in Japan, and maybe we will, with the fans and all the athletes having had a year to train properly, and you have a proper buzz and how you'd want it at the previous Olympics, I'd possibly say, okay, let's do that. But the lesson for me of the past 12 months is that the rules keep getting changed. And so that it's like a few months ago, vaccination was going to liberate us. And then we're vaccinated and then something else comes in and it's like, oh, you know, there might be a variant. I mean, maybe there is a variant, but something else comes in, which again delays it somewhat. And so my fear that is the more we play the caution game too much, it'll just get more and more cautious, and we'll end up being several years until we can go back to having the Olympics. So there's a line. At some point, you have to hold the line and say, let's do this. But at the same time, you have to do it in a response. You know, there's a real pandemic going on, so you have to judge it, and it's quite a difficult thing. But I'm just wary always of going more and more cautious and more precautionary, because at some point you have to halt the line and say, we're human beings, we need this culture, we need this sport, we need this interaction, and we just have to find a balance.
That is the issue now, is the balance and the different approaches that are being taken sort of globally around these issues. Because I think it's quite interesting that one of the themes that's come out, points of discussion that's come out around Wimbledon this year, with them having announced that there won't be a Henman Hill and there won't be the normal traditional queue and so on. And this is all post the June end of lockdown deadline date and so on. And I thought it was quite interesting that John Isner, who's the US #1 tennis player, was calling on the Wimbledon authorities to kind of consider how the US PGA Tour is approaching these things, and saying that you know, the golfers are given more latitude to you know, show their own personal responsibility, take accountability for safety and so on. And I mean, one of the things that Wimbledon is saying is that instead of players being able to stay as they usually do in the houses in the Wimbledon village, so that they're very close to the courts, it's very easy for them to get their training programs, get their courts, they get picked up by the drivers and so on, and it's a 5-minute drive from their houses to the courts. I mean, now they want to have a few specified hotels in London that are COVID safe. And I'm not surprised that the players are pushing back, because they're having flexibility in other countries. And, you know, the UK is now clearly and justifiably being seen to lead in the whole vaccination program. Our lockdown is supposedly ended, and yet we are now putting Wimbledon on under very strict and very precautious measures. And I think this is just the balance that every part of society, it doesn't matter whether it's sports or arts or business or whatever, has to find. But there is some point where the precautionary principle can't dominate every single element going forward. And you know, I do think it is interesting for sports people, because particularly global sports, because they are traveling, and every, you know, the Australian Open was a very good example of that, because the quarantine restrictions there are much more draconian than they are in other parts. And it's very difficult to be an elite sports person, particularly in a global sport, when you are subjected to so many different regimes and protocols.
So I want to change tack a little bit now, and because it's quite easy to find lots of things to be doomy and gloomy about it over the past year. But I just wonder if there's any positive lessons of the past year in terms of sports. I mean, to give an example, I've spent this morning speaking to someone about the way that vaccines, you know, the kind of scientific advances of vaccines have been remarkable over the past few months. So is there an equivalent in sport in terms of things that have happened that we might draw some positive conclusions and lessons from, or is there nothing that you can think of in that respect?
I thought this is maybe a little bit flippant, but it's something that I personally found quite interesting, is the way in which I got interested in a sport I had zero interest in before because of lockdown. And it was Formula One. Now, funnily enough, I've never driven a car in my life. I never learned to drive, and had no interest in the sport until I watched the Netflix thing, through boredom, of course, as we all have, and watched the Drive to Survive series, and was absolutely captivated by that sport. And I found myself watching the Tottenham, Sunderland, Man City series on, you know, the behind the scenes stuff in football, and taking a deeper dive into a sport I really do love. So there was a sort of, you know, there was a side to lockdown that gave me insights into sport that I hadn't had before. I studied in America when I was a kid, and I'm a big basketball fan. I managed to watch a lot more American basketball than I ever had before as well. So there was something about lockdown as a spectator that gave me plenty of time to explore and dabble in sports I was maybe unfamiliar with, or thought I didn't like, but turned out to like after all.
I'm very much the same as Donald. I think it was finding new sports when football wasn't on. I remember when there was no sports on, UFC was the only one going on. And I'd find myself at 4 a.m. watching UFC, a sport I never really liked. But I think, yeah, the positive is finding sports that I've never watched before and really falling in love with them. I think tennis, basketball and UFC, I probably wouldn't be a spectator of if it wasn't for lockdown. And now I'm in love with all of those sports. So I would say that was a positive.
There've been some really exceptional examples of best practice or best performance from a number of athletes in different sports. For example, I suppose Joe Root's run scoring that he had in Sri Lanka and India earlier this year. I mean, three centuries. I think 2 of them were double. He was only one of 9 batsmen, I think, ever to make a century on 100th test. And you sort of think, in spite of all of these restrictions, and you can only imagine that there's been less access to training, routines have changed and so on, biosecure bubbles where there's a lot more isolation. I thought that was a very interesting positive. Getting back to the Australian Open, I mean, Jennifer Brady, who was, I think, the 22nd seed and was one of the 72 players who ended up being quarantined for 15 days before and had all the privileges around the 5 hours of daily training, I mean, taken away. And those players had to spend 15 days locked up. She had a career best performance and made the final, and it was the first time she'd ever reached a Grand Slam final. And she said that one of the reasons for that was actually that she took advantage of actually not overtraining, because she felt she had probably overtrained in the run up to that particular Grand Slam. And then I think there were some examples as well in the Six Nations, with Scotland beating England at Twickenham. I think, what was that, the first time in 38 years that they had won there. And there really have been some outstanding examples of players and teams who have performed to their personal best during this time. And I think it maybe brings into to the forefront of discussion is, some of this focus that's very much on marginal gains and the very tiny minutiae of what you can do to improve. During this time, people have had to rely on their own mental fortitude, their own self-discipline, and I think that is something to be said for that.
It's just because I started with saying that absence makes the heart grow fonder, and I think the absence of crowds I think it's been useful just to remind us the importance of crowds for the sense of theatre, and actually for the teams on the pitch. I mean, if you had said at Christmas that Liverpool would lose 6 games on the trot at Anfield, then you would be laughed out of town. But that just shows you the importance of the crowd, particularly for a team like Liverpool in a stadium like Anfield. And we've seen these perhaps surprising results like the Scots winning at Twickenham, and maybe part of that was the fact that they didn't have a crowd behind the England teams, and created an opportunity for them. In terms of technology, I suppose, I mean, the thing about the really top draw sport is that the technology has been so good for quite a long time, so I don't think there's been any great gains there, apart from perhaps the failure to recreate the buzz of the crowd. I mean, it is surprising that we've had the sort of like sound effects sort of like popped into live football broadcasts, but it does seem a bit weird, really, when you see a player scoring a goal and running past completely empty stand, but there's apparently crowd noise going on. There's been that sort of like canned laughter put in there. I mean, in terms of technology, I'd love to get rid of VAR, but that's another debate altogether. That's nothing to do with lockdown.
Picking up on both Christine and Rob's point about the absence of spectators, I think this is a hot debate in football, and I watched keenly those middle ground teams like Aston Villa and Everton and so on, and greatly enjoyed. I was actually in a pub, curiously, just before they closed them down, watching them thrash Liverpool, put 7 goals in. And I remember myself and my friends were remarking on how free the young Aston Villa players, you could see the freedom they had on the pitch because there wasn't the Liverpool crowd pressure. So I think in a sense, the absence of crowds has had a very interesting causal event, as Rob said, on some results. You see a more competitive sort of, set of teams with young players who played well. And of course, the Six Nations was one of the best Six Nations ever, not a single spectator. So maybe funnily enough, spectator pressure can sometimes dampen games in a way. Coming to the technology side, this is really quite interesting, I think. We all if you were a parent, you had to be involved, or a teacher or lecturer. I'm a professor at university. We all had to teach online. Everybody on the whole planet. So we had blended learning, and then we had blended eating, with Deliveroo or whatever. We had blended entertainment with Netflix, blended work. We're all working from home. And in a sense, I think we've seen there's some interesting things happening on sport, because I think, funnily enough, this lockdown has perhaps increased people's access to streaming. Declan gave a good example of UFC. I also found myself up at 4 o'clock in the morning, frequently watching that. But it changed my whole view of streaming in some sports. But I've been involved in several things with FA and other big organizations about online coaching and training, and that is happening on scale now. It's given a shot in the arm to these big international bodies. You can do things. I have a friend, Georgia, who's a trained referee, who did lots of online courses during lockdown and is coming in at a much higher level. All sorts of interesting things happening on that level. A lot of sport isn't about training on the field, as it were. There's psychological training and all sorts of theory behind it as well. So I think there's a sort of increased online component in the sport. Data analysis is number one. Another really interesting one, where there's much more attention paid to the world of AI. That's the field I work in, artificial intelligence and data gathering. If you watch going back to the Formula One Drive to Survive, the cars are really like printers. They're a bit like peripherals hanging off a network of data. The whole sport is driven by this wonderful sort of set of screens in the pit. The whole thing is driven by data. That's what really made that series sing for me in many ways, the way in which technology and sport is melding and coming together in a way.
And I was speaking to someone last night who was telling me about the way that football season tickets are going to be handled over the coming period, which is the days of old paper tickets are, for many clubs, long gone, and they've been replaced by kind of credit card entry systems or whatever. But the new plans are now to, and this is kind of a little bit bearing in mind the whole thing of vaccine passports about to come about in the coming months, it would seem. But the new thing is that football tickets are going to be managed through an app system on a phone, which is going to make it extremely difficult for people like myself, I have to admit, who have had a share of season tickets over recent years, because it's so expensive to go to football, and someone has a ticket and you acquire a few games from it. But the coming of an individual mobile phone sign into the ground is going to make that impossible. So are there other things on the horizon that have come about in the past year, but which might have a longer term impact?
I am hoping that when the human beings return to sport as fans and just as active participants, when they're a factor in sport, that this domination of the technology, particularly in something like VAR, hopefully will retreat. Because at the moment, if you had a football match, the response of the crowd and the response of fans was always a very important factor in things. At the moment, when they're there, it's VAR, the third, fourth official, this, that, and the other, which just dominates everything. And you have a very sterile, bureaucratic thing when everything is somebody's arm is offside, not offside, or whatever. And hopefully we can get back to a more passionate sports, where other things dominate. And unfortunately, during lockdown, the advance of technology has meant that the human side has been removed. Hopefully it'll come back. But I'm also worried in what Alastair's just said in the relation to whether they're called vaccine, COVID certification, vaccine passports, or whatever, that you've had 20 years where there's been more regulation of football fans, often through various kinds of authorities or police monitoring and CCTV. And now I can see, less so in culture, but more in sport, there seem very few barriers. I've heard sports representatives, sports organizations saying, come on, government, you need to speed up bringing these things, because then we can get at least some fans back, some kind of medical certification. And so having medical certification as a proof that before you can go to a match may be common sense on one level, but it sets a new precedent in terms of people going to events and what that means. And particularly in today's world, how long that would last. If you thought, oh, it's going to happen till the end of the year, maybe that's one thing, but I don't sense that. So yes, it hasn't happened yet, but it would seem to me to be a cause for concern. And the way it's being done at the initial football matches, where whole sections of the population are being told, no, you just can't go, that in any other walk of life would have been considered discriminatory. But because it's this and because it's COVID, it's accepted, whatever the rights and wrongs. So it's, to me, that's definitely a cause for concern.
I want to respond to that. And I had a really, a terrible day this year on the 2nd of January. And it was the anniversary of the Ibrox disaster where 66 people died. And it's the nearest that I was on that staircase, 13, and nearly died. I was only 14, sorry. And even now I can't speak about it much. But we have to put spectators' rights first. The Hillsborough disaster happened this day 32 years ago. Mm-hmm. Sport, when it's allowed to drive over the safety of spectators, has done some terrible things. And I do not accept this argument and will not accept that we put human beings at risk for the sake of kicking a ball around on a football field. I saw death with my own eyes. I nearly died myself. And I think it's remiss of us ever morally to put human life at risk because of a spectacle and entertainment.
I'm going to bring in a slightly different tack here, Alastair, just looking at potentially some different trends. And I think one of them that is quite interesting and goes also to your point around sort of technology. It's more around online gym training and, the future of gyms as we know them, because I think one of the challenges for gyms going forward is that many people have found ways to exercise and train at home or in different environments now. They've taken up different sports because they can't go to gyms, they can't exercise as they normally do. And I think many people, Joe Wicks started the trend very quickly early on in lockdown with everyone suddenly saying they were doing, particularly for the kids in the mornings, sort of half an hour of gym online. And I think it is going to be very interesting going forward for the likes of the big gym chains to keep their memberships up, because it was, in the last couple of weeks when I've been back to the golf club and been chatting to people, many people have said, well, we've got our own exercise regimes now. I don't think we're going to renew our membership, or we're going to put it on hold for 6 months and see what's going on. So I think there is this issue, which in one way I think is very positive, in that people, because they haven't been able to fall back on the gyms or say, I'm going to see my trainer and I've got these appointments 2 or 3 times a week. There's definitely a sector of people who have now kind of really taken responsibility for their own training, their own exercise, their own regimes. And I mean, I do wonder what that means for the future of the gym industry as we knew it before lockdown and now post-lockdown. And I think there's been a lot of discussion about what has lockdown done on people's exercise, personal exercise, mental health. And I think to some extent, it's been very negative. And another extent, it's kind of shown, perhaps like some of these people who have had best performances and personal bests, is that when you really take accountability for your own well-being, and we've really had to try and do that under very difficult circumstances. People have spoken about a lot more eating and drinking during this period. And I think it's cause for a lot of reflection in many ways around personal responsibility and accountability for our own health and well-being. And that's definitely something I've picked up in the last couple of weeks, being back around people in a just a membership sort of environment playing sport. But, those are some of the trends that people are talking about now.
So I want to push on a little bit, and I want to ask you a question about the way that sport has been discussed and particularly the way that people have responded to some of the issues over the past year. I'm thinking particularly about the extent to which we've been free to speak out about some of these things. I mean, to take an example, there's been over the course of the past year, the introduction of taking the knee within football. And it's become very much something that has taken hold. It remains, I'd say, relatively unchallenged over the course of the year. So is there, and this is one of the things that we're trying to do with this lockdown inquiry, is to ascertain the extent to which civil liberties and freedom of speech has been either helped or hindered over the current period. So how has this played out in sport? I mean, Declan, you're a heavy social media user, which is where lots of these controversies tend to blow up. Have you sort of any thoughts on this? Experienced any changes over the past year?
What came up was Wilfried Zaha recently refusing to take the knee, and that was a massive controversy. And now he's one of the few people that doesn't take the knee, and that kind of stands out as you know, an individual player saying his opinion. And I don't think the players have really been able, or the sports people have been able to make their opinions, whether it be on the pandemic or on different issues, without being kind of, you know, berated or put down because of the pandemic as an excuse. You can't have your opinion or a right to do something. So yeah, I would say that mainly.
Declan, you know, mentioned the behaviour of players on racism on the pitch. Because of the absence of spectators, you didn't have that sort of throwing bananas on pitches type lunacy, as it were. That was a good thing, obviously. But, you know, I think it threw attention to racism on the pitch a little bit more. So there were several incidents that were really, you know, you got those close-ups, and if you were watching those matches, you could see the visceral anger in the black players when they were clearly racially abused by somebody right in their ear. We had teams walking off, of course, famously, just in the last week or two. So I think in a funny sort of way, it gave focus to player racism, which is quite an interesting difference as opposed to spectator racism. And that's probably, I mean, it's not a good thing in any sense, but I think it may accelerate action by the authorities in those sports around the sanctions for that type of behavior. I get the feeling that it's pushed it faster, well, at the speed it should be going, to be honest, because some of the behavior is clearly outrageous. On the taking the knee thing, you saw real differences between the Eastern European teams, none of who took the knee, for example, and the English teams who did. So there are vast cultural differences here in reactions to the BLM movement as well.
With relation to all these things, you just wish the fans were back, because the Millwall fans got a rap when they criticised QPR, whoever it was, for taking the knee. But fans often speak a truth, and when something becomes an orthodoxy very quick, I mean, in fact, Wilfried Zaha made some of these points later, but when something becomes just done and you don't really know what it's for and it becomes an orthodoxy, then people, you know, stand up against it or question it or whatever. And that's what happened there. You had situations where people were flying these stupid flags over some of the football grounds. And you just think, if there were fans there, nobody would take any notice of these planes flying, you know, when that White Lives Matter banner went. And you just think, if there were fans there, nobody would take any notice of that banner. It's just because it's the only thing there. So I think, you know, I think that's the, you know, I think that's the case. And certainly some of these campaigns have used that period for this purpose. But as Donald rightly says, as we saw recently with the, you know, the Rangers example, fortunately, those examples are certainly in a small minority where there's real racial abuse. And as you can say, you can tell when something happens and they're forced to respond. So that's, you know, that's definitely the case. I mean, just on the fans and on the previous point, it's a difficult thing because football fans have for generations been treated very badly by either people who run the sport or own the grounds, or by the authorities. And it's quite a difficult thing and a very much done to. And it's quite a difficult thing to think now how to bring fans back in a safe way, in a way where that doesn't happen again. I mean, that's my concern with the whole, with some of those other issues of what's going to happen going forward. How can fans go back in a way where they're not almost like guinea pigs for whole kind of social experiments, but do it, as Donald says, in a way that's safe for them and safe for anybody else that goes. And those things are real dilemmas that you know, that need working out going forward.
That seems a good moment then to move, because we're coming to a close now, but going forward, how is that going to work? I mean, has anybody got any thoughts on, what would it take to get sport to recover just now? I mean, in whatever sport it is that you want to comment on, I mean, what would be the thing that is desperately needed as soon as possible to get everything back on its feet? I mean, there's some obvious ones in terms of people have spoken about in terms of getting fans back, but there's also, there's a lot of businesses and institutions and clubs that are really financially under the cosh at the moment. So there's obviously a financial element, but anything that you want to pick up on in terms of just getting us back into the world of sport?
It struck me, we talked about the Olympics earlier, but the Olympics, the original Olympics, lasted for 1,500 years. They had a COVID break of 1,500 years until 1896, the biggest break ever in sport, I suppose. But it came back with vigor, and we all love the Olympics. And whether it's delayed by a year, it's on a 4-year cycle anyway. I think once, as Christine said, once we get these big tournaments, we got the World Cup coming up, European Championships in football, the Olympics whenever they happen. Once these big spectacles that excite the whole world come back into flow, we'll have put this behind us, I suspect, and we'll be back to full stadiums when we have successful vaccinations in those countries. So I'm really optimistic about all this, in terms of the return of spectators. Jeff's right. Sport is diminished in the absence of spectators, because even if you're watching it on television, you get the effect of the spectators at the event. It's 2 + 2 = 5. We all look forward to that. So I'm quite optimistic. I think go back to the UFC. They were amazingly adaptable on this by simply being sensible, getting an island and doing it. The other sports blundered forward, football especially, still holding events until the last minute. So I'm really positive about the future here.
Really just gets back to the point I was making earlier about people who will adapt their behavior, and if they want to play sport and certain areas are closed down to them, they'll find different ways of exercising and so on. And I think one of the things that has been noticeable during the year is the commentary around the number of people who've uptaken tennis and golf, for example. And I saw that there was a survey conducted on English golf quite recently, and they said that since lockdown and then the opening after the first time in May last year, that 60% of English golf clubs have increased their members. So I mean, that's a huge number of people playing golf who weren't doing before, trying something different. Apparently 45% of clubs now have waiting lists for members to join. It used to only be 22. The waiting list used to have around 20 people on them. The average is about 34. And I think it's not, I mean, this just happened to be a golf survey that came my way, but I hear anecdotally it's the same with tennis, a lot of people taking up. So I think conversely, the more something is taken away from you, the more you realize how much you value it. And as I said, I think a lot of people have made plans to continue to exercise, to continue to find ways of playing sport as soon as they can. And I think that the importance of exercise in whatever way it's taken has been emphasized in a strangely negative way, but in a way that will, in the long term, I think, be beneficial, with the government saying, you must take your exercise out each day and giving the hour in the regulations and so on, which is an acknowledgement of how important just moving, of playing sport, or just keeping your body healthy has come to the fore. So it's a conversely weird way of saying that something quite negative can turn into something very positive, because the emphasis on this has become greater. And I think the emphasis on it from a mental health perspective has become much more to the front as well.
Well, I think when we see Harry Kane lifting the European Championship trophy on a sunny day in Wembley, we'll know we're close. And I think at the moment we're getting closer. Like, I'm playing Sunday League. I'm waiting for a tennis club. So I think it's going to come in stages. And I think at the moment we're experiencing the stages, and it's going to take time, but I think it's looking good at the moment.
Yeah, I'm happy with Harry Kane lifting the trophy, and I'm happy with Alastair and maybe Donald having that image of England lifting the trophy in July.
Being Scottish, you know that you've got a lifetime of disappointment ahead of you in international football, that you're never going to see that ever. I really liked listening to Declan, because the future is really with people like Declan and his anecdotes about getting into new sports. I think that was heartening, you know, the fact that it's allowed Declan to sort of do some exploration and get into new things. The futures were not people my age, but Declan's age. I think that was the most heartening thing I heard today about the, you know, funny positive effects out of COVID. But.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that Harry Kane lifting a cup would be a bad image to leave me with, but I know it's going to be Andy Robertson lifting a cup, and we're all going to be happy. But Rob, your final thought.
I mean, nothing particularly profound. I mean, we just need to, like, as Geoff said earlier, we have to, acknowledge the successes that we're making in terms of dealing with the pandemic, so that we don't keep fighting the last battle. If we're succeeding in tackling this pandemic, and all the signs are that cases and deaths and all that are far lower than they were in the past, even just like 2 or 3 months ago, that we don't sort of hold back too long from a sense of overcaution. I think it'd be great to get fans back into the stadiums, even if it's in a limited way, as soon as possible. We can do that in a COVID-safe way, I think, in quite a cautious way, and still get some of the buzz back into the grounds. In terms of supporting clubs at the moment, I mean, we have a problem that we're only allowed to drink outdoors, and we've got pubs who've got financial problems. So why not convert football grounds into Nightingale pubs, where people can go out and drink under a roof safely and securely? But apart from that, I have nothing else to offer.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And thanks to all of you, actually. It's been an enjoyable conversation. I mean, there's a million topics that we probably could have touched on in terms of thinking about sport and pandemics and, you know, the impact and what needs to be done in the future. But I thought we got through some excellent examples, and I think that kind of reflective discussion is quite important, because it should help us to think and properly take stock of what it is that the last year has meant, but also, quite importantly, I think, what it means for the future and how we need to respond to some of the things that are coming up and the challenges that we're undoubtedly going to face. So I really want to thank you all for being such good sports and contributing fascinatingly to this discussion. So thanks very much to you all.